Hello and welcome to this lecture on Introduction to Cultural Studies NPTEL course. We just finished with Lyotard. We looked at the postmodern condition. We looked at the ways in which postmodern condition creates some unique cultural identities, cultural formations and cultural situations. So what we'll do today in this lecture is we'll start with a new text, which is Frantz Fanon's Black Skin, White Marks, which is a profoundly political text. As the very title suggests, Black Skin, White Marks is about the colonial condition. It's about how identity is produced in colonial conditions, how identities are subjugated in colonial conditions, and more importantly, how identities were almost always a product of violence, right? So how violence is very much a part of, is embedded in the entire politics of production of identities in a colonial condition. And the reason why we choose Fanon is that apart from being a philosopher, apart from being a really profound critique or cultural commentator, he is someone who believes that, or his writing reveals his belief in praxis, in real activity, in real action. So one of the things you'll notice immediately about Fanon is that there's a directness about his writing, there's a direct engagement with a real political situation in his writing. It's not rhetorical, it's not jargon heavy, and he speaks from a position of an insider inside an activity, someone which is something which is already happening, a certain cultural activity, a certain colonial activity, a certain political activity. So that's one of the first things we need to know about Fanon, and that characteristic, that feature is revealed immediately in his writing: the directness, the clarity, the urgency for action, the urgency for activity, a sense of immediacy, which are the characteristic features of Frantz Fanon's works. Now, this particular book, Black Skin, White Marks, as the very title suggests, is about performative identities. It's how you can have black skin and put on a white mask and you become some different identity, which is obviously a product of violence. It's a violent process of identity formation, because what happens in the entire process is that you subjugate your skin identity, your epidermal identity. So epidermalization is a process that Fanon talks about quite sort of deeply in this particular book, and we'll talk about that later as we move on to that section. But just to give you an idea, a flavor of what this book is all about, and the reason why we're looking at this book in particular in cultural studies, because it's something which engages directly with the idea of anxiety of activities, anxiety of the activities which produce identities, the anxiety to produce a privileged identity, a hegemonic identity. And obviously, along with that anxiety, associated with the anxiety is a paranoia of being found out as a non-hegemonic identity, a non-dominant identity. So quite clearly, there's a hierarchy in identities in a colonial condition. We saw that in Pava, we saw that in Orwell's Shooting the Elephant, how this particular hierarchy also is associated with a sense of ambivalence, right? So the hegemonic identity is also ambivalent because it has to be hegemonic all the time. Whereas the ambivalence operates in some other way as well, in terms of looking at how the colonized native wants to be like the colonizer. That's the aspirational activity, the aspirational identity. But in the process of becoming the colonizer, he's obviously not the complete colonizer, because he doesn't really have the real political power. So he sort of half leaves behind his own identity, his original identity. So he ends up becoming a sort of half-chopped identity. And therein lies the violence, therein lies the metonymic quality of identity production in the colonial condition, which is what this book is all about, Black Skin, White Marks. And obviously, one of the reasons why we go to Fanon, along with the fact that he is a profound commentator on the cultural condition, he's a profound activist who is really and actively engaged with the real political and colonial condition, is that he was also a psychiatrist by training. Now, he is one of the real philosophers, one of the first real philosophers who brings in psychiatry and political condition in a really fascinating study of identity production and the anxiety of identity production and the psychopathology related to anxiety production, identity production in a colonial space. So psychiatry in Fanon's work becomes an instrument to look at the way in which identities are produced, subjugated, reproduced, violated, etc., and how this constant violence, which is part of the identity production process, becomes an endemic condition, becomes a pathological condition. So he's sort of someone who looks at the medical extensions of this anxiety, which is political inequality. So this collusion between medicine and politics is something that Fanon studies and examines quite deeply, profoundly in his works. And obviously, part of the psychiatry training that Fanon has is also used to critique the Eurocentric psychiatry, the Eurocentric psychological studies, which were heavily racialized before Fanon. So he exposes the racial character of European psychology, or Eurocentric psychology, and he talks about European trained psychologists, and he mentions quite a few of them. Who talks about the Africans in terms of a very racist kind of rhetoric. It talks about the low intelligence of Africans, the innate murderous violence in Africans, all these very racist connotations that are sort of published in quite sophisticated journals, and European medicine, European psychology, etc. And Fanon is one of the first philosophers, one of the first people really to critique the tradition, to critique the biomedical or biopolitical branding of a certain race, in terms of essentializing it as a murderous, violent kind of a race. So Black Skin, White Marks does a lot of things. It reveals the violence of identity production. It reveals a very complex and almost evil collusion between medicine and politics in terms of branding a certain race, in terms of branding a certain ethnicity. And more importantly, it also talks about the aspirational activity in the part of the colonized. So what can the colonized do in this kind of an identity production where he's branded as a noble savage, either a benevolent savage or an anarchic and murderous savage, a violent savage. So what can a colonized do in these conditions? So Black Skin, White Marks is a profound commentary on the culture of production of identities in a particular colonial condition where identities are extremely unequal, and this inequality of identities is what creates the violence in the first place. So before we begin with Fanon's works, before we begin with Fanon's words and directly into his language, let us first take a look at two introductions which are used in this particular book. So this book has a couple of introductions. The first is by Ziauddin Sadar, and the second is by Homi Bhabha. So we'll take a look at both these introductions, and we'll probably spend this first lecture on Fanon examining these introductions and how the introductions set out really to describe what Fanon does later on in this particular book. So how does introductions talk about to situate Fanon as a cultural critic, to situate Fanon as a political commentator, and how they sort of look at the significance of Fanon's works, especially in relation to the world we live in today. Because remember, when Fanon was living, he wasn't really studied extensively. He wasn't really considered to be a profound philosopher or a profound cultural critic. It's only after his death, and that very early, very young, it's only after his death that his importance as a cultural commentator was truly emphasized and resurrected, not least with the help of Jean-Paul Sartre, who wrote this really fabulous introduction to Wretched of the Earth, another of Fanon's books, where he talks about the importance of Fanon as a philosopher of the colonial condition. And what we learn from Fanon, both as people who are colonized as well as people who are colonized, right? So he gives you a very direct commentary on a colonial condition, and the directness and the clarity of expression that Fanon has makes him almost as a universal philosopher, so someone who speaks of times which are universally valid for humanity across spaces, across times, across cultural conditions. So though he speaks specifically on the French Algerian condition, that's the condition he talks about, the French Algerian colonial condition. But the directness of his expression, the clarity of his expression, the sophistication of his expression, they find relevance in almost all conditions where colonialism was operative as an instrument of torture, instrument of discrimination, instrument of domination. Okay, so let's first take a look at Sadar's book, Sadar's introduction, Ziauddin Sadar's introduction to this particular book, Black Skin, White Marks, where he gives you, sort of introduces what this book is all about. What is Black Skin, White Marks all about? Now, first of all, he says, Black Skin, White Marks, and I've highlighted the sections which are important for us. Black Skin, White Marks offers a very particular definition of dignity. So dignity becomes a very important category in Fanon. It becomes a discursive category, it becomes an existential category, it becomes a psychological category. So what does Fanon mean by dignity? So dignity is the ability of a particular self, a particular human being, to live with agency, to live with freedom, freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of movement, and freedom of identity, more importantly. So dignity is that kind of a condition which doesn't make you anxious or aspirational to assume a certain kind of identity just because it's a privilege, just because it's hegemonic. And it's that kind of a condition which does away with any kind of subjugation to knowledge, subjugation of identity, etc. So Black Skill White Marx offers a very particular definition of dignity. Dignity is not located in seeking equality with the white man and the civilization. It is not about assuming the attitudes of the master who has allowed his slaves to eat at his table. It is about being oneself with all the multiplicities, systems and contradictions of one's own ways of being, doing and knowing. It is about being true to oneself. Black Skill White Marx charts the author's own journey of discovering his dignity through an interrogation of his own self, a journey that will not be unfamiliar to all those who have been forced to endure Western civilization. So dignity in Fanon becomes a very important category. It becomes an ontological, psychological, as well as a political category, as I mentioned. And the discursive quality of dignity has to be highlighted over here, because dignity is that condition which is not marked by any anxiety to emulate the colonizer. It's not marked by any anxiety to or any aspiration to mimic the colonizer. It's that condition which allows you the freedom to be what you are as an ethnic self, as a cultural self, as a racial self, as a political self, and as an existential self. So your race, your ethnicity, your language, your politics, your gender, your body belongs to you. And that sense of belonging, that sense of ownership over who you are, over yourself really, is what constitutes dignity in Fanon's works. And that's something that Siddha highlights very beautifully, I think, at the very beginning of this particular introduction. Now, as I mentioned, and this is what Siddha goes on to describe later on, that Fanon also began to use psychoanalysis to study the effects of racism on individuals, particularly its impact on the self-perception of blacks themselves. During the 1950s, metropolitan France was a center of revolutionary philosophy and a magnet for writers, thinkers and activists from Africa. Fanon imbibed the ideas of philosophers Jean-Paul Sartre and became friends with Ottavio Benoni, French psychologist and author of Psychology of Colonization. A young man searching for his own identity in a racist society, Fanon identified with the African freedom fighters who came to France seeking allies against European colonialism. He began to define a new black identity and became actively involved in the anti-colonialist struggle. So when in 1953 he was offered a job as the head of the psychiatric department in the Bilder-Zoenville Hospital in Algiers, he jumped at the opportunity. So as you can see at the very beginning, what Siddha tells you quite interestingly is that how Fanon was profoundly influenced by philosophy, and of course he was a psychiatrist by training, and was living at a time when psychoanalysis was beginning to get racialized, right? And this is something which we need to understand in cultural studies, and because part of the cultural studies, a large part of cultural studies, as I hope to have established by now, is about identity formation. And identity formation, of course, is a discursive process. And this discursive process includes a lot of material apparatus, which includes medicine. So medicine becomes a very important instrument in classification in cultural studies, especially in colonial conditions where identities are unequally distributed, right? So psychoanalysis, psychiatry, these become very handy instruments of discrimination, very handy instruments of classification, racist classifications in colonial times. So what Fanon does, he uses psychoanalysis to study the effects of racism. So what effects does racism have on subjects who suffer racism? The sense of being discriminated, the sense of being tortured, the sense of being left out, the sense of being subjugated. So these become almost pathological conditions after a point of time. This constant replication of discrimination, the constant replication of domination. So this generates a sense of inferiority, a sense of alienation, if you will. And alienation becomes a very important category in Fanon's works, because alienation is not just a Marxist alienation where the producer is removed from the product, but also a profoundly existential alienation. And we saw when we read Orwell's Shooting the Elephant how alienation can be a compound of the Marxist category, which is materialistic, as well as a more existential category, which is more psychological. So psychoanalysis in Fanon becomes a very interesting instrument with which he studies or examines the effects of alienation in colonial conditions. And of course, so he was someone who was profoundly influenced by philosophers. So, for example, Sartre, as you know, was a philosopher in the existentialist tradition. And existentialism, of course, is about, it tries to examine the selfhood of man, the sense of selfhood of man, especially the way it navigates with its material surroundings, especially the way it navigates with its ideological discursive surroundings. So Sartre becomes a very important figure in any study of Fanon. And as I mentioned, Sartre wrote a really famous preface to Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about how this particular book, Wretched of the Earth, is a profound book in exposing the hollowness of European civilization, exposing the hollowness of European imperialism, and talking about how identity, self-agency is subjugated systematically in colonial conditions. So the sense of subjugation, the sense of being subjugated, becomes a pathological condition, and that's something that Fanon studies with his psychoanalysis, with his training in psychiatry. Okay, so so that gives you a very interesting idea of the location of this particular book. So when was this book written? What stage in Fanon's life was this book sort of produced? And what were the cultural climate which produced this particular book? So what was the cultural climate that Fanon was consuming, that Fanon was a part of, and Fanon was critiquing? So again, like you said, I mean, this is something I keep saying throughout this particular course. So any text is produced out of context. You can't possibly divorce a text from its context, right? So the context determines the text to a great extent. So what kind of book has been written is largely determined by the cultural conditions, the political and discursive conditions of that particular time. And that's a bit of a cliche in cultural studies. It's something which we assume automatically. Now, for this particular book, Black Skin, White Marks, obviously this is written at a time where French imperialism was at its headiest peak. And Algeria was a French colony. So it's largely this interaction between Algerian condition and the French condition, or Algerian-French condition, the French-Algerian condition, which obviously was characterized by discrimination, characterized by racism, characterized by hierarchy, which is one of the grand narratives of colonialism as we know it. So Fanon wrote Black Skin, White Marks when he was 27, so he was quite young when he wrote it. Published in 1952, it was his first and perhaps most enduring book. And it was ignored, unsurprisingly. So, it was a book which was written at a time where, the mainstream publishing society, the mainstream readership, the mainstream European clientele wasn't ready for this book at all, because this was a book which was written from the other side, right? It was a book written, by someone who actually suffered colonialism, someone who actually suffered the discrimination of imperialism, and someone who actually spoke back in a way that was sophisticated and erudite and compelling. So it was something which was conveniently ignored by the white mainstream hegemonic press, or the white mainstream hegemonic readership at that time in 1952. So, and it was ignored. Its significance was recognized only after the death of the author, particularly after the publication of the English translation a decade and a half later in 1967. So again, the politics of translation becomes a very important, very important method in making someone famous and making a writer sort of visible to a wider audience, because the original book was written in French, of course, and it was sort of relatively ignored, relatively sort of not given an importance at all. But only after this English translation, a decade and a half later, 15 years later, 1967, it was resurrected in terms of its significance. It was a year when anti-war campaigning was at its height, and student strikes and protests that began at Columbia University in New York started to spread like wildfire across the United States and Europe. So again, why this is a very important and a very interesting study, why certain books become important suddenly at certain points of time. So what are the cultural conditions which sort of condense together, as it were, to invest importance to a particular book which was relatively forgotten previously. So this particular book, Black Skin, White Marks, is a classic case in point, because when it was originally published in 1952, it was ignored. It wasn't really paid attention to at all. But it's only after 1967, when the student protests were at the height, when there was a general agreement about the evils of imperialism, a general agreement about the evils of the grand narratives of European power, European hegemony, European control, etc., where there was student protests in the streets of Paris, and this entire idea of the independence of Algeria became almost a national cry among the young people across France. It was only then, at that particular cultural climate, this particular book was resurrected. So this became a very important book at that point in time, because it was a time which is ready to relate to this particular book. So this idea of being ready to relate is very important when it comes to assigning importance to certain books. So when certain books become important at certain points of time, it's just about being in sync with the contemporary or with that kind of cultural climate which is around at that point of time. So 1967 was a time generally of protest, generally of student unrest, generally of cries against evils, imperialism, and it was also the birth of post-structuralism. Post-structuralism as a phenomenon was coming into being, was really shaping up in a sort of massive way at that time. So it's not a surprise to us that it was that time which is ready to sort of read and resurrect and relate to this particular book, which was published half a decade, 1.5 decades earlier. So Martin Luther King at that time was leading the civil rights movement and was to be assassinated a year later. Advocates of black power were criticizing attempts to assimilate and integrate black people. So this was a time where black intellectuals, black protesters were really sort of coming together in a massive way, in a profound way, in a very instrumental way, in a compelling way, and critiquing the evils of imperialism, critiquing the evils of racism, critiquing the evils of looking at black people as some kind of an essentialized category. And Martin Luther King was obviously one of the forefronts of this particular struggle. So he was assassinated a year later in 1968, as you know. So this was a time where this kind of debates were at the height, were at the peak. So it's unsurprising that Fanon book, Black Skin, White Marks, was massively popular at that point of time. So the book caught the imagination of all who argued for and promoted the idea of black consciousness. It became the Bible of radical students in Paris and London, outrage and exploitation of the third world. So even the metropolitan white students in Paris and London were outraged when they read the book Black Skin, White Marks, because, as I mentioned at the very beginning, this is a book which is a very compelling revelation of the evils, the torture, the assassinations, not just assassination at the physical level, but also identity assassination, which happens during colonialism. So it obviously becomes a very, very revealing text, which tells you what really takes place during imperialism, what really takes place in colonialism. So it's a bit of an insider's account, if you will, of the evils of colonialism as seen by Fanon and as described by Fanon. And the reason why, and I'll come back to the point again, the reason why this becomes a really revelatory book, a really compelling argument, is because Fanon looks at colonialism, looks at the effect of colonialism from a medical perspective as well. So it's not just a political text, it's not just a text which is sort of politically important. It's also a text which is medically important or biopolitically important, because he is using psychology. He's a trained psychiatrist and is using his psychological training, his training in psychiatry, to look at the effect of colonialism as a systematic process of exploitation, a systematic process of other formation, a systematic process of projecting inferiority or inventing inferiority of a certain population of people. And what happens if you keep consuming this idea of inferiority? What happens if you keep consuming, you keep suffering this subjugation of dominant power? So it's that kind of a book where the medical and the political coexist as instruments of study, instruments of examination. So, as Sardar says over here, Black Skin, White Marks was the first book to investigate the psychology of colonialism. It examines how colonialism is internalized by the colonized, how an inferiority complex is inculcated, and how, through the mechanism of racism, black people end up emulating the oppressors. So, racism works in surreptitious ways. So, I mean, obviously it can work as a blunt way of torture, discrimination, exploitation, etc. But racism can also work more effectively as a means of consent. How, if we manage to create consent, if we manage to inculcate the idea of inferiority on the colonized population, then you get willing subjects who basically end up aspiring for the colonizer's position, because the colonizer's position becomes a privileged position in their imagination, right? So that becomes more of a psychological condition then. So that is the second level of imperialism, the second level of racism, right? Because racism would excel, would triumph completely when it manages to become a psychological condition where you consume it without questioning. You consume the superiority of the white man without questioning it. You consume the superiority, you presuppose the superiority of you presuppose the privilege of the colonizer without questioning it. And therein lies the greatest triumph of imperialism or racism. Okay. So, then you have black people end up emulating, unquestionably emulating the oppressors. So it is due to the sensitivities of Fanon, as Ashish Nandy says, that we know something about the interpersonal patterns which constituted the colonial condition situation, particularly in Africa. Right. So Fanon talks about the interpersonal patterns, how this kind of an activity of emulation, aspiration, anxiety becomes an interpersonal category, an interpersonal narrative, if you will, which marks the colonial condition in a very solid kind of a way, in a very regimented kind of a way. So Fanon began a process of psychoanalytic deconstruction that was developed further by Nandy in The Intimate Enemy. So Ashish Nandy has this really interesting book called The Intimate Enemy, where he talks about, he sort of draws on Fanon to a large extent, and then extends the argument further by looking at the ways in which the entire idea of othering, the entire idea of being an other, being this inferior other, the exotic other, becomes a profound psychological condition, and it can be studied psychoanalytically through the prism of inferiority complex, how inferiority complex becomes a narrative which is sort of created and consolidated by the different vectors, the various vectors of imperialism and racism. So Fanon began a process of psychoanalytic deconstruction. So again, we're talking about two different categories coming together, psychoanalysis and deconstruction coming together to produce psychoanalytic deconstruction, which basically reveals the constructed quality of this, the artificial quality or the artifact of the white man's supremacy. And so the white man's supremacy, the white man's superiority becomes an artifact of the highest order, which obviously creates the other artifact, which is the non-white man's inferiority, right? The whole point of the success of colonialism, the success of racism, is how these artifacts began to pass up as givens, began to pass up as unquestioned or unquestionable givens, which are just presupposed in the colonial conditions. So Fanon was one of the first people, really, to begin a sophisticated study of this collusion between, medicine and politics, and that's something which is deconstructed later by Ngugi Wa Thiong in Decolonizing the Mind, 1968. Right, and other theories of colonial subjectivity have followed their footsteps. Okay, so what makes Fanon an important person in cultural studies? Why are we interested in Fanon at all in terms of looking at identity production, the violence of identity production, the violence of cultural identity from productions, etc.? And the reason is not far to seek, as Ziauddin Sadar tells you immediately. Fanon writes from the perspective of the colonized subject, and this is up on the screen. Fanon writes from the perspective of the colonized subject. He's a subject with a direct experience of racism, who has developed natural and intense hatred of racism. So he's someone who has a first-hand experience of suffering racism, right? So, and racism is something which is not just a dry discursive thing for Fanon. It's a lived experience. It's an experiential category for Fanon. And from this experientiality of racism, he offers an active engagement which deconstructs racism. So we have to understand that when we read Fanon, is not really a cold, dry, a clever intellectual who is passing off lovely theories to examine racism, to examine discrimination, to examine biases and colonial conditions. But he is someone who actually experiences it, and he speaks from his position of experience. This is why I mean what I mean when I say he gives you an insider's account of how racism works. He gives you an insider's account of how discrimination works, and that is why he is so important for us today. This insiderness, the clarity, the directness of his experience. So, racism or colonialism become experiential conditions of Fanon, not just dry discursive conditions. Okay, so and then, of course, this whole idea of deconstruction, this whole idea of opening up the grand narratives or exposing the grand narratives of imperialism and racism is written in a way which is deliberately discontinuous, deliberately fragmented. So there's a change in style off and on. He leaps across registers of resentment. So there's direct resentment, there's discursive resentment, and all those different registers of resentment become very important in Fanon, because that's part of the process in which it's deconstructing the whole grand narrative of racism, which operates primarily on the presumed supremacy of one race and the presumed inferiority of the other race. Okay, so, and hence we have the text is full of discontinuities, changes in style, merging of genres, dramatic movement from analysis to pronouncements, switches from objective scientific discussion to deep subjectivity, transfers from theory to journalism, complex use of extended metaphors, and not least, a number of apparent contradictions. So, all these different categories come together in Fanos' writing. So it's a fragmented text which basically deals with discontinuities, because it talks about discontinuities and identity. So it's no wonder it's written in a style which is discontinuous. So there's a frequent change of style and merging of different genres. It becomes very directly dramatic in some ways. It becomes objective and scientific in some of the ways. It becomes subjective and actively involved in some of the ways. So it is something. It's that kind of a text where emotions, passion, subjective emotions merge with objective analysis. And that's what makes it a really important text for us today, because it's not just theorizing on the colonial condition. It's actually speaking from an experience. It's speaking from an experiential position, and that's what makes it such a vibrant and plural text, right? So he merges theory with journalism, he merges metaphors, he merges contradictions, he merges objectivity with subjectivity, he merges objective medical knowledge with first-hand subjective experience, and all this merging, coming together, all these sort of very confused mergers which are happening in this particular book makes it actually a very important book for us today. It makes it a very sort of post-structuralist kind of a text. And again, I go back to what we were just saying about the birth of post-structuralism, which is simultaneous with the student protests, with this protest against the governments, with the protest against racism, which is happening across the metropolitan centers of Europe, including, but not limited to, London and Paris. So the rise of post-structuralism, this sort of spatio-temporal fragmentation, discontinuity. So all these different categories of post-structuralism are actually historically synchronous with the rise of, for instance, the Algerian War of Independence. So Fanon could be looked at as a philosopher of post-structuralism, as someone who's actually practicing post-structuralism in a real political space. And his expressions, his descriptions of colonial conditions are supremely post-structuralist, profoundly post-structuralist, in a sense that it uses and it brings in different metaphors, it brings in different disciplines together in order to study the colonial condition in Algeria. And again, as I mentioned, although he's speaking specifically on the French-Algerian colonial condition, the clarity of his expression, the humanness of his expression, the humanity, the universality of his expression gives it a timeless character. So that Fanon's descriptions could find resonance in almost all colonial conditions, because he talks about the heartbeat, the beat, the real pulse in which colonialism and colonial oppression works, the real experience of being discriminated, the real experience of being tortured, the real experience of being left out, the real experience of being alienated. So the reality of the experience gives it a sense of universality, which makes them a supreme philosopher of colonialism. Okay. And of course, the most important chapter of this particular book is a chapter we'll study in great details when we read the book. It's called The Fact of Blackness, where he talks about the very idea of being black in a white space, and how the fact of blackness becomes an ontological factor, an existential factor. It becomes a lived reality. It becomes a discursive reality. It becomes a discursive condition as well. And again, how this merge between discursivity and reality becomes very important in Fanon's descriptions. So we see the injustices described being lived in front of our eyes. This is most evident in the chapter on the fact of blackness. Here Fanon breaks out of all convention and simply lets this stream of consciousness wash out into the paper. So it becomes a very subjective description of blackness, a very subjective description of subjugation. So hence we have this expression, stream of consciousness. So it becomes a very first-hand narration of what he actually suffered as a human being, who is racialized, who's reified through this racial metaphor, this racial rhetoric. And what does this reification do at the level of alienation, the level of alienating him at a human level, right? So that is described to us in first hand, and in this chapter, Fact of Blackness, which gives it a vibrancy, a poignancy, which makes it profoundly human in quality. Okay, so all this whiteness that burns me. I sit down at the fire and became aware of my uniform. I had not seen it. It is indeed ugly. I stopped there, for who can tell me what beauty is? This directness, this simmering anger makes us uncomfortable, because civilized society does not like comfortable truths and naked honesty. So again, this idea of whiteness the Fanon talks about is obviously an artifice. The whiteness it talks about is, the black man speaking in a white man's tongue. So that's what makes a black person white. So this whiteness burns me. I sit down, as Fanon says, I sit down at the fire and became aware of my uniform. So again, uniform is something which you don. You don and doff, you put on and put off. So it has an artificiality to it. It has an artificial quality to it, uniform. And that's what makes it. And also, if you use the word uniform quite so carefully, uniform comes with uniformity. So when you put on a uniform, you're actually standardizing yourself. So you're doing away with subjectivities, you're doing away with your internal contradictions, you're doing away with who you are as a person, and rather you're putting on a standardized jacket, a straight jacket rather. So uniform produces uniformity of appearance, of embodiment, which does away with your sense of true self, what you are as a person, what you are as an Algerian, what you are as a person belongs to a particular community. That has been done away with. What we have instead is a sense of uniformity which is standardized, which is sort of tragically levels out all differences. So he becomes aware of his uniform, of his white uniform, and then he goes on to say, I had not seen it. It is indeed ugly. I stop there, for who can tell me what beauty is? So this idea of beauty and ugliness, what becomes beauty notionally at a discursive level actually becomes ugly because it takes you away from what you are as a person, right? So your sense of ownership on who you are, what you are as a person, the ownership of yourself, on yourself, goes away, dissolves away, and what we have in its place is a discursive, dominant discursive mode where uniform or the mask becomes more important than your face, than your biological body, than your free human will. So this directness, this anger. So anger again is a very important effect in Fanon. So he's a writer who makes you angry. He's a writer who writes in a way which is designed to make you angry. So it is very, it's a very agitated kind of writing. It's very animated language that he uses, and part of the process of the anger is very, very sort of deliberate. It's a very deliberately angry text, which wants to do away with any kind of dry rhetoric, which wants to do away with all kinds of dry discursive theorizations, but instead offers you, a very direct description of what it really means to be exploited, what it really means to be subjugated, what it really means to be tortured by the colonial condition, tortured at an epistemic level, tortured at a physical level, at a visceral level, and at a level of embodiment as well. So this makes us uncomfortable. This particular book becomes a very uncomfortable text because civilized society does not like uncomfortable truths and naked honesty, right? So the naked honesty, and again, nakedness becomes a very important category in Fanon. There's a directness of its expression. There's an explicit quality about its expression, which makes it very, very unsettling because it doesn't really use metaphors. It doesn't hide behind metaphors. It doesn't hide beneath language. So he uses language to communicate, to actually scream his anger, to vent out his anger, and that becomes unsettling from a position of the white colonizer's perspective. However, that's the whole point of Fanon. He wants to unsettle, he wants to make the colonizer embarrassed, he wants to make the colonizer ashamed. So shame, anger, resentment, hostility, so all these come together, all these exist in Fanon's writing quite deliberately and quite directly, and this existence, this sort of this mixture of all these different attributes, which are otherwise politically incorrect, gives Fanon's writing a sense of clarity, a sense of sophistication, a sense of directness, which makes it almost universal in its scope. So we'll stop here today. We'll continue with the lecture on Fanon in the subsequent session. Thank you for your attention.